Regeneration and Finance. Before we start, it was with incredibly sad news that Councillor Wendy Fitzgerald passed away around Christmas time. This would be the first time a meeting she would have had within the city and county of Swansea. I know that the leader will have comments and tributes at council, but I would ask if everybody would put their cameras off for 1 minute, just as a mark of respect to that wonderful lady. Thank you. Thank you all very much indeed. First item on the agenda is apologies for absence. I do have one, and that's from Councillor Chris Evans. Has anyone else got any apologies for absence? No? Okay, thank you very much. The second item is the disclosure of personal and prejudicial interests. Members first. No? Then
schools.
Officers.
Sorry, as schools are mentioned, are we all supposed to do it as governors?
I wouldn't have thought so, not in this circumstances, because it's a generalisation as opposed to individuals, isn't it? So, any officers? No. Okay. Second item is the prohibition of votes and declarations of party, which is the normal item which is brought to every scrutiny board. Item 4 are minutes of the previous meeting of the 10th of December. I'm sure you've all read them. Any comments on those minutes? Are really happy? Okay, thank you. Then we move on to item 5, which is public questions. We do not have one any at this particular time. And then we move on to item 6, which is the budget proposals. I thank the leader for attending this morning. I'm asking, would you like to say a few words before we ask Mr. Ben Smith?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. And appreciate the opportunity just to say a few words. Look, just some headlines from me before Mr. Smith goes through his usual technical run through of the papers. You'll see in there that the position for next year is significantly improved over and above what we were planning on. And remember, the previous planning assumptions were provided by the previous UK government prior to the election. So the UK budget in the autumn did change the position for Wales and therefore for local government significantly. We are still carrying some significant risks, I'm sure Mr. Smith will allude to, in terms of not having absolute clarity in terms of the recompense for national insurance contributions, although we've been given a good indication by Welsh Government, but that still remains a risk. But overall, the position is significantly better than we were previously planning on. So whilst it is an improvement, as you would expect us to say, it does not fix all of the problems. I think local government were lobbying for some 600 million of additional funding to meet all of the pressures across local government. And it's circa 260 million that we've received in terms of a settlement. But again, 260 million is a significant improvement over what we were originally expecting. In terms of turning that into Swansea, we've been funded at about 4.7%, which is above the average for Wales. And for local authorities, that range is quite wide, and there is lobbying going on at the moment via the WLGA for the floor to be raised in terms of settlements for local government authorities. Whether that happens or not, that shouldn't really affect the position for Swansea. Our position would largely remain static in any outcome there. In terms of additional sums that we're highlighting within the document, you'll see that there's a proposal to provide some additional 20 odd million pounds to schools this year. Just to be clear on that, we took the decision last year to include some additional local one-off resources. That was by providing the entirety of the IT reserve to schools, in addition to some one-off energy help. That improved the situation in Swansea schools last year significantly, over and above what they would have received as a fair share of the funding via Welsh Government. So whilst it's a £22 million improvement over what they would have had last year as a base amount, obviously that additional one-off amount from us was within that figure last year. So the actual increase is closer to 11 million in terms of the improved position for schools this year. But again, you know, schools were planning on the basis of that 11 million dropping out and them having to make some significant savings. So again, in the discussions myself and Mr. Smith have had with head teachers, again, they welcome the position that we've laid out as an indicative position for schools. We have had some indicative amounts for grants as well this year. There are some ones still left to receive. Primarily they're flat, and again, given that we have inflation still above the government's target, that does cause some further pressures. But again, the budget proposals that you have before you there, whilst they do see savings of around 13 million or so being required, there is still a net investment over and above that of close to 50 million in terms of the investment into services this year. So a much improved and changed position from the planning assumptions, but with some really difficult decisions still left before us in terms of making sure that we deal with the pressures that we're seeing. And just to touch on those pressures in a bit more detail for you, you'll know that social services across the UK remains under severe pressure. No different here in Swansea. In terms of pressures at our front door, they're up 20%. And again, as we'll come to the second quarter monitoring report in due course, there are some pressures in year that are being dealt with in terms of recovery plans, but significant pressures in social care. And of course, that's a demand-led service, so it's not one that has, you know, emerged through anything we've done. It's just that the pressures have built, and we are working to try and ensure that people who need social care from us get those packages of care as quickly as possible. Likewise, a similar situation in housing and homelessness. Housing and homelessness pressures across the UK remain severe. Again, the numbers of people presenting as homeless, not just in Swansea but across Wales, remains very high. And again, we are committed to continuing to do all we can to get people safe places to sleep, and then on to temporary and permanent accommodation as quickly as possible. But that is incredibly challenging situation currently. So those are in-year pressures that we're facing, which will continue into the new year. So they are pressures that are not going to go away as we go into 2025-26. So, Chair, hopefully that's a helpful run through some of the headlines. I'm sure Mr. Smith will run us through in terms of his technical comments on the budget, but happy to take questions afterwards from members.
Okay, thank you, Leader. Excuse me, Mr. Smith.
Thank you, Chair. I will repeat a bit of what I said at Cabinet in terms of overarching technical advice. I won't go line by line through. I'm sure there'll be a number of specific questions of me. As the leader has alluded to, the single biggest risk that I face and the council faces is not about next year's budget, but the current year's budget. There is a structural risk around rebalancing the 24-25 position for me to be in any way, shape or form able to certify as reasonable and credible the 25-26 budget position. You will note that the next item on the agenda in terms of second quarter, and more crucially when we get through to February the third quarter, is weighing heavily upon me. And it doesn't take a genius to work out that those pressures are real, and the leader has rightly drawn attention to them. I have to advise that the Welsh Government has said it might not pass a budget. Both the First Minister and the Cabinet Secretary for Finance have said that. My own view is that that is a hypothetical risk, but it is a technical one. There is not the electoral maths in the Senedd for it to automatically pass a budget. and there has been experience of what happens in the Northern Ireland executive, where money doesn't flow to recipients if a budget isn't passed. I have to repeat it, but I think it a technically unlikely outcome. We are in a position nationally that there is a bit of an issue with national growth. Any assumptions on future spending plans by the UK Chancellor, the Welsh Government and individual local authorities is entirely conditional upon what we might get in future years, and my RSG assumptions, whilst not heroically optimistic, may need to be revised in the absence of current UK economic growth and the ability to raise public spending. It is a provisional settlement, as is normal in mid-December, for it to flow through to this early January report. And as I expected and advised both to yourself as a panel and to council, national insurance is outside of the settlement at this stage. But as the leader has said, we have an indication of likely amounts. Not ideal, but it is helpful to have an indicative amount for ourselves. I continue to be desperately concerned about those that are not included. That is a political matter for UK government, which ultimately flows down to Welsh government. But the immediate pressures on the care sector and the voluntary and third sector weigh heavily upon me and will weigh heavily upon every council. I did also explain to Cabinet that the compensation event for public sector employees is going to be a little bit bonkers. For example, I need, as this council, to receive the compensation event for retained part-time firefighters because the Fire Authority does not receive revenue support grant, so there is no obvious mechanism for compensating them. And a whole raft of the levying bodies who are conditional upon us setting our budget are themselves having to work that out in the absence of certainty of what might they get and how it might be delivered. The wider economic impact, both in terms of administered stuff around national insurance, but also national movements, means that prices are likely to be higher. And I have continued to retain some money in central inflation, but obviously it is a risk as inflation is looking to tick up significantly, not to the high levels we had in recent years, but still the trend is upwards. I made an assumption on pay of 2.5% going forward for future years for both teachers and local government. We don't set either of them. It is for others to determine. And I am aware that the UK government has already submitted a suggestion of 2.8% in its review to England, but also there are mixed messages coming from the UK government around needing to be tough and making tough choices on future public spending envelopes. So there is some risk there. None of them are material enough for me to reopen the position that I'd assumed post the October budget and running through to getting a draft set of papers in front of you. The interest rate scenario is incredibly difficult. You will all be aware of wide-scale reporting that bond yields have risen significantly, and that's important for us because our PWLB borrowing is linked to bonds plus 1%. Our strategy should remain unchanged, which is take advantage of our fixed low-cost borrowing, which we did years ago, and advantage of higher variable short-term rates on our cash on deposits, which means there is a short-term windfall, which you saw in 23-24 and repeated in 24-25's budget monitoring. And you should expect some short-term gains to continue going forward, but they will unwind. And the difficulty I will have is the point at which I have to externalise deferred borrowing. You are aware I have deferred £50 million worth of existing capital and the £25 million for the Mumbles CRMP Sea Defence Scheme. And at the moment, those rates are completely unattractive. And I repeat the advice I gave to Cabinet. You should not borrow at this point in time or for the foreseeable medium term. We want to wait for rates to come back down to a level that is affordable and manageable. The current ones certainly aren't. And we will not repeat our 1-point-something% rates that we achieved previously. Consequently, we may need to be more strategic and tactical around some of the choices that need to be made between this cut of the rough first budget, produced only a couple of weeks after the settlement from the Welsh Government. There are a number of shifting factors, some which may benefit us, some which may not. It is part of the mix of seeing what turns up from any final settlement, any electoral maths in the Senedd around any prioritisation of the services, any support or change in stance around compensation events for national insurance, and any clarity that might be given both to those of us that are due to receive compensation and what may happen to those in the third sector, private sector supplying direct services to us, and some of those shadow items where there are a number of bodies who levy or precept off us, who are themselves having to make those decisions in a degree of lack of knowledge, which will impact upon our budget. And it'll all start to firm up in the next few weeks. But as planning assumptions for now, they are reasonable. I do reserve my judgment on the adequacy and reasonableness of it once I get to third quarter monitoring. We won't speculate about third quarter monitoring today, but I'm sure we'll have several questions of me about the second quarter monitoring in due course. That ends my technical advice, but there are some quite technical matters in the report nested in there, and I can anticipate some of the questions that may come from panel members, and I am more than happy to answer them when asked. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, members. I have the first question from Councillor Peter Black.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Just going back to this social care issue, the quarter two monitoring says you're having to pull £12.4 million out of earmarked reserves to rebalance in this year. I'm just wondering what the impact of that is going to be on this budget. If we're looking at, I mean, obviously we haven't got the quarter three spend yet, but if that trend continues, have we actually got enough money in the budget for next year to actually cover the demand which social services are under, the pressure that social services is under?
So perhaps if I go first with a technical response, I will defer to the leader who has indicated to come back in. At a technical level, my advice to Cabinet was that a tolerance of 6 million for social care and 2 million for place was acceptable in the current year, mitigated by one-off actions. I gave advice that there should be no longer-term mitigation, and for the avoidance of doubt, the budget is predicated on services recovery plans, getting them back to as near to ground zero as possible. I think that's a tall order, and some of that may be mitigated by still carrying some money in central contingency, some in central inflation. We are likely to have less in both. I shall come on to that in the second quarter report. But for the avoidance of doubt, the budget is predicated on directors living within means, Cabinet members supporting directors in making decisions to achieve rebalancing. I made very clear to Cabinet and throughout the budget build process, and the leader alluded to it, there is no new money to address the structural issues that all councils face, as he rightly said, in the areas that you would expect. Every council in the land, social care, to a degree schools, not so much us because of the emergency action we took, and homelessness. And there is no money in the system. That's the biggest driver of why local government asked for 600 million, got 260 million. Yes, it's a big settlement. It's very much more helpful than we anticipated based on the previous government as planning assumptions, but it doesn't address the £400 million gap between the two. So that's my technical advice. It does not at the moment provide for additional money to address that structural issue. There isn't enough money in the system. I do hold central sums which will provide some mitigation, but at this stage, if there is not a significant rebalancing of the position in the current year, I have to have concerns about the reasonableness and credibility of the future budget, and I will give advice accordingly when I have to certify that in both February to Cabinet and March in Council. It's not a pleasant place to be, but it is the technical harsh reality, Councillor Black.
Yeah, I can just go a quick follow-up. This may not be answer this, Ben, because really need, I think, the director here. But in terms of if extra money was to be made available, is the capacity there as well to meet the demand? You know, we did have that extra money.
As you say, that's a matter for the director, relevant director, to advise on that. I'm sure there is quite a lot of flexibility and technical capacity, but my real concern of the wider perspective is given even if more money were available for us to spend, is still that concern about providers and fragility in both private sector social care provision and the third sector and voluntary sector if there is not a change at either UK or Welsh government level about who gets compensated. I can say no more than that because I get very close to making political comments. I am not allowed to do that, but I am allowed, in my view, to give technical advice that the absence of money for those bits must limit the capacity for anyone to just step up provision, is my view. But you're right, you'd have to ask the Director of Social Services on that for more assurance, Councillor Black.
Okay, thank you. I've got the leader has come in to answer a question, and then Councillor Will Thomas. Leader?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Just to add to what Councillor Black said and to what Mr. Smith replied with. So firstly, just put the 12.4 into context. If you remember at our first opportunity post the start of the new financial year, we made a decision to uplift social services by £6 million. That was funded out of the surplus that we had coming into the year. So the gap, therefore, currently is around £6 million. But of course, as Mr. Smith alluded to, we have recovery plans which are predicated on people reducing that back down to a reasonable level by outturn. Now, in previous years, that has been successful, and directorates have been able to mitigate that risk entirely, and we've ended up with a reasonable surplus at the end of the year, which has then been reinvested in services. It gets more difficult this year, given the scale of the pressures that social services are facing. So again, I wouldn't expect social services at this stage to get back to zero, but I would expect them to make significant inroads in terms of where they currently were at Q2. Likewise for place in terms of the homeless pressures. I think there's a mixture of things going on at the moment in a more broad sense. We continue to lobby Welsh Government for assistance on things like the social care cap and other measures that they may need or be willing to take action on to assist local government in terms of its pressures. We've obviously wait to see what we get in terms of the money for children's services, in terms of the aims that Welsh Government have to remove profit from children's services and the programme around that. So again, that's still an unknown at the moment. And all of these are potentially helpful measures that Welsh Government may take. And as Mr. Smith alluded to, there is some discussions and negotiations to be done with other parties at the Senedd around support for the budget in order for it to pass the Senedd. And that's likely, we would have thought, to focus on areas that will bring it into the sphere of local government, because many of the things that Senedd members will be concerned about, I'm sure, will be in the areas of service delivery that local government is responsible for. So again, there are some things in there. In terms of your final point, Councillor Black, having spoken to the director yesterday on this item, I don't think there's a capacity issue for us. Clearly, getting the right person at the right time with the right skills is a challenge sometimes. But I think this one is more around the fact that certainly some of the placements that are being made in children's services that the courts make decisions on, as we've seen in the past, can end up being extremely expensive ones, over £100,000 per placement. Those are costs outside of our control, but we do have to absorb them. And again, in terms of the costs that will inevitably feed through from some of our independent and private sector colleagues who provide care on our behalf, the insurance payment, the insurance costs are likely to add pressures in those areas as well. So it is a moving feast, and it is one, as I said, that is more difficult to resolve entirely this year. But I do expect the director and the social services cabinet members to be making the various efforts to bring down those overspends by outturn.
Councillor Black, do you want to come back on social services?
Just come back on that, Rob. You've already said that Welsh Governments are trying to get profit out of children's services. I know that we're trying to bring emergency accommodation for homeless in-house as well, with ongoing efforts there. Is it not time to also look at maybe bringing some more social care in-house to try to mitigate some of the costs which we're not going to be able to meet through compensation, for example, on national insurance at some stage?
Absolutely, and I've been an advocate of a national care system for a long time, and I believe the public sector has a bigger role to play as long as it's funded appropriately, and that's always been the challenge, I guess, from whatever government you're dealing with. They have to provide the necessary resources in order for us to provide a greater element of public sector delivery. I think if you look at the children's services proposals at the moment, then there is already a move to more publicly delivered support for children's services, because the private sector has started to disengage and has therefore become more expensive in that area. So you will see more provision being delivered in children's services area, because that is the most economical way of delivering that care now. But again, I've been a fan and an advocate for some time of us taking a much more robust approach in terms of trying to have a national care system or service that sits alongside the national health system or service. I think it's sensible to have publicly operated systems. What we have at the moment, as you'll be aware, is a public health service which is largely public in the health sphere, but largely private in the care sphere, and that is, I don't think, the most sensible arrangements for us to have. But in order to change it, you've got to put lots more money into care.
Okay, thank you very much. Councillor Will Thomas.
Thanks, Chair. Yeah, it's a very quick question from me. Obviously, the money we borrowed for the capital programme, obviously that was a very low interest rate, which is fantastic. And again, congratulations, well done for that, Ben. Just wondering, obviously we're gaining interest on that. I'm just wondering how much that is roughly, you know, the rate that we're gaining interest and how much we're benefiting per year on that, and what happens to that money, please. Thank you.
So I can answer with some very tangible specifics in terms of old years and give you some hints as to what is to come. At outturn for 23-24, I declared a £17 million surplus underspend on capital financing driven by elevated rates. The second quarter report that you're going to get in a moment indicates at least a £7 million windfall in the current year. Given that rates have proven incredibly sticky, both as base rates and bond yields have gone the other way, the fact that we borrowed at 1% and have lent out most of the year at 5% plus, we can even lend out at near that rate to the DMO, which is the government. It's an executive agency of the Treasury. I would anticipate that that £7 million surplus will grow at third quarter and at outturn. That gives you the order of scale. That is the easiest £10 million, £17 million, £7 million ever made. Frankly, in terms of the amount we'd have to do in an individual service above the line to generate that, would be enormous. The issue we have is that I am drawing down on cash balances at all times, and at some point surely rates will start to drop, and I do have an obligation to externalise more debt. The strategy is very clear. I'm on the record. Those windfalls are temporary, they are significant, and in line with the strategy that was agreed at council in terms of the advice I've given year after year after year, all of the underspends to date on capital financing have been added to the capital equalisation reserve, and that has been used to enable me to provide cash to continue to internally borrow and avoid external borrowing, and to provide significant short-term resource cover for individual capital schemes. A number of them, I can't go into the exact details because there have been a number of exempt items to Cabinet in recent months around funding large-scale items. The schemes themselves aren't secret, but the commercial confidentiality of them are, and it's provided a very useful means for being able to provide support. There is a linked issue, which is the current budget proposals do assume some modest draws from capital equalisation reserve in setting the budget. That is a deviation from previous technical advice. It's not one that I am 100% comfortable with, but it is one that is logical, because there is £5 million referenced in the Welsh Government's draft budget, where they are looking for authorities to prove that they are doing additional capital spend. What they're basically offering is additional revenue money to support a large addition to the overall capital programme. Details on timing and whether it has to be borrowed, it can be internally done, are still to be decided. But that draft budget for Wales indicated at least £5 million of additional revenue support could be available. What that buys will depend on inflation and rates and such like. So that's one of the reasons why I've got a technical draw from capital equalisation reserve over the years in setting the budget. And the other thing that is much more clear is the deferral strategy, which means we will have to externalise at some point at higher rates than we were used to. You see on the MTFP, the last year, the step up in capital financing costs, but you also see reductions in capital financing costs in years 1, 2 and 3 in that MTFP, simply because we are able to make short-term gains. The longer term, which worries me, as I alluded to at Cabinet, is that it becomes much more expensive for us to externalise, and certainly I wouldn't want to externalise today. One has to hope rates are a bit frothy and they will come down, but very short term, for an authority that borrowed all of its need to borrow long term at 1% and is able to continue to temporarily put it out at 5%, 4.75%, it's nothing but win-win-win for me as a technical treasurer. But my concern is you must all understand, as I'm sure Cabinet and Council does, that these are temporary effects which help significantly insulate the authority in terms of its in-year pressures and provide substantial capital firepower for the authority to be in charge of its own destiny as to what it spends on and the timing of such. So I hope that gives you an answer, Councillor Thomas.
Okay, well, are you still with us? Councillor Thomas, are you still with us?
Yeah.
Oh, right.
Yes, Chair. Sorry, I did a thumbs up. Thank you. Cheers. Thank you.
Okay. Councillor Mary Jones?
Yeah, sorry, I'm not sure if I heard correctly, so that's why I wanted to clarify it. When Ben was speaking just now, he said about internal borrowing, and if I was correct, what does that actually mean, to the lay person? Do you borrow off other departments? Are you moving things between budget headings? That's what I really wanted to find out. Thank you.
So it doesn't quite mean that. I'll try and explain a bit more candidly and for layperson's terms. At any point in time, I have substantial cash on deposit. That is because the majority of our earmarked reserves are cash backed. I'll give you an example. If I underspent by 17 million, which I did at the end of 23-24 on capital financing, that enabled me to put 17 million pounds into the capital equalisation reserve. I also had 17 million pounds more in cash. So when I then need to find 10 million pounds to support a scheme, I say I internally borrow it from the capital equalisation reserve. It does mean in practical terms, I am drawing 10 million pounds of our cash, and at some point I'll have to go out and top it back up. So what that means is, that's what I mean by internal borrowing. What it means in practical terms is I've got less cash in the bank for the next 3 or 4 years. So as my cash balances go down and as interest rates go down, I lose on my investments, but I get myself a time to try and borrow at an external rate. So I don't move it around departments. The treasury management function is controlled centrally by a very small team on my behalf, and it's washed through that way. Not every reserve and every provision is fully cashed back, but the vast majority are. So the general reserve is cash backed, the HRA reserve is cash backed, the majority of the earmarked true reserves are cash backed. All of the ones that become the audit whales, technical unusable ones with the billions on is the funny money stuff. But at its simplest, you can assume that almost all of the reserves are cashed back. 130, 140 million pounds worth of cash backed earmarked reserves, 12 million of general fund reserves, 16 million pounds worth of HRA reserves. It gives you a clue as to at any point in time how much cash I am holding, and I'm currently holding, therefore 185 million pounds in cash to meet monthly payrolls, payments to third parties, and to finance the capital programme and include that internal borrowing. So I know it's quite abstract and technical, and I'm probably quite lazy in my assumptions as to what I mean by internal borrowing. But what that basically means is I don't go out and get another mortgage. I draw down on my savings in my big council ISA.
Now, if you understood that, Councillor Jones, well done.
I think so.
Okay. Councillor Linda James?
Thanks, Chair. This is a technical question. We have a number of people across the city who get council tax exemption, some of which will live in wards that have also got community councils. So there are some residents in a community council ward that are not paying towards the precept of that community council, but the community council still get the full amount of their precept. Am I right in assuming that that means that Swansea Council is subsidising the community councils?
Simple answer, no. The exemption calculation decides ultimately the relevant tax base for Swansea and each of those community councils. So the reality is, if there are exemptions, for whatever reason, the tax base is lower, and it means that general taxpayers subsidise the rest in Swansea as a whole, and the same applies for community councils on an individual parish basis. So Swansea does not step in and subsidise the difference. Community councils may set any precept they see fit to do. If there are exemptions and other discounts and allowances, the base is lower, so the smaller number divides into the same fixed higher number. It just means the amount paid by everyone goes up a bit at the margin. Now, for the council as a whole, that is probably less material than it is for community councils on an individual basis, which I think is probably one of the points you're making, Councillor James. But that's how it works. It's not that the council steps in and subsidises it. It's why it's washed through in and out through our budget setting. It's above the line and also below the line. The major precepting authorities do not touch our budget requirement. The minor ones do, but only for the purposes of working out the amount in each ward stroke parish stroke community council. So Swansea does not subsidise. Residents in each relevant area effectively subsidise if there is an exemption or other discount provided. And the same applies if there's a premium, then some people are subsidising the other way. That's how it works, Councillor James.
Thank you.
Councillor Jeff Jones.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. Yeah, it's table 1, you know, the information actually shown there. A couple of points really, and shall we say note 9, it's the remove use of reserves to partially fund energy prices, and it actually says short term, but it seems to be over the next 4 years anyway, and that's actually funded by Remove Schools Temporary Funding. What impact is that actually going to have on schools? Are they actually going to make that shortfall out of their own reserves?
No, exact opposite. Because the MTFP is a rolling programme, the 24-25 budget was set with that as an example of an additional £7 million added to schools and £7 million coming off reserves. Because it's cumulative, I now need to remove it from each future year. So it is the technical device to strip schools back from their 201 million level to the 190 level. But the budget proposals then add £22 million to schools to get them to the 222 million. So what the leader has previously said still stands. It is merely the technical device to remove it from last year's MTFP because it was factored in temporarily. It doesn't have any further impact on schools. The amount that schools will get cash to cash is an additional £11 million. From their baseline, it's £22 million, as the leader quite rightly said. And I think you will see it when you see very wide differing levels of proposed council tax from the numbers of authorities that have already given their indicative. Majority of authorities did not put an emergency one-off injection in, and you have got the majority of authorities with schools facing negative overall reserves, and that is why they're having to rebalance their budget in the current year. The leader and I take a view, we put a down payment in advance down, albeit on a temporary basis, that we turned into permanent. So you should not assume that that's coming off the position already reported for schools. It is the technical device to achieve what we've already said, which is it's £11 million additional cash, and the one-off £11 million is made base. So base to base, they're getting £22 million as proposed, Councillor Jones.
Okay, thanks for that. And, you know, the funding, number 23, council tax increase, actually says 25-26, 9.872 million. What does that equate to? And actually going on to the following year, it jumps up to 20 million, 0.4 million. How was that actually calculated? On what sort of percentage are we talking about? I know it's got to be agreed further down the line, but how do you actually calculate those figures?
So the reason for the jumping up is because the figures are cumulative. So at whatever rate is applied 1 year, that's where you see it growing, it's seeming inexorably, because I do make an assumption each year. We do not traditionally in Swansea reveal an exact amount at this point in time. The MTFP consistently, because I like consistency and smoothing, is routinely predicated on a range of 3 to 7% with a central assumption of 5. All of those years are consistent with that assumption. If you were to push me further, if you got your calculator out and got that yield figure divided into the old tax base, it would clearly currently be above 6 in terms of yield.
Right.
But don't forget, yield is driven by assumptions on the collection rate, where we added 1%, and the tax base growth, which was reflected in the decision that council took in December on my advice. So on the basis that I can't directly give you a specific answer, because some authorities choose to go out with an exact number before they've even started the consultation, my view is the same as the leaders and cabinets, which is that is not always helpful, but it gives you a flavour of it. If you were to get the calculator out, you could work it out, but I must emphasise that includes those two items, both of which grew. The tax base and the assumed collection rate both grew in the decision made by Cabinet in December. That's probably all I'm prepared to say at the moment, but it gives you an indication of the range, Councillor Jones.
Okay, thanks very much.
Leader, you want to come back in?
Yeah, Chair, just not to labour that point, but just to make the point that it isn't a figure that you can rely on as a council tax increase, because there are numerous factors, as Mr. Smith has said, that get you to that point, not least of which we make decisions every year in terms of whether we draw from reserves or other balancing factors, or perhaps following consultation, we decide to go forward with further savings. So all of those things can help square that circle. I think in terms of the Welsh Government assumption, they are expecting councils to balance their funding with council tax of around 10%. We've been clear publicly that we're not intending to go anywhere near 10% in terms of Swansea's council tax. But if you look around Wales, you will see a range, I think, from 4 up to 15% in terms of where authorities are looking currently. We're not going to be at the top end of that scale.
Thank you, Leader. Any other members? No? Thank you. I have a number of questions. What I'll do is I'll start off with the savings, if I may, and that's on page 34. If you go to page 34, and I'll go down the list, because I think the savings proposal on the top list, and list 1, it gives you an outline of it, but I think we need, as a scrutiny board, to look at the specific savings that are in this proposal. And on page 34 is the start of them, and there are a number in there which I think need to be qualified. If you cannot answer those questions today, then fine, as long as we have them as soon as possible, because I think it's very important going forward that we do have them. I think the first one is there's £100,000 in corporate services, legal and democratic services. Savings arise from a review of legal and democratic services budget. I think we could do with a qualification on that. And then if we go on to corporate services, education total, there's 2 worrying things in there. And that is the one, increased charges for catering services and SLA for schools, considering the fact that we now have free school meals in the primary sector. I think that 300,000, where is that going to come from, really? And there's also an increase in the SLA for cleaning, but I assume that's really an ongoing increase in line with inflation. But the 300,000 is quite a worry, considering, as I said, about the free school meals. There's a core staff cost offset by grant and non-delegated, a savings of 975,000. Again, other than asking someone in the education department, I think that is something we need to think about and where that's coming from. Then there's the miscellaneous, which in the finance department. I'm not going to even begin to ask Ben about that, because I think we'd be here until about 3 o'clock in the morning with his explanation on that. But I think the next items about place are the ones that really are concerning. Additional income generated through significant increase in WIRS programme of £1 million. Again, I think we'll need an explanation of that. And then the next one is the one I think that the public need to be concerned about: the wholesale reconfiguration of waste collection arrangements, maximising incentives for residents to recycle based on achieving long-term targets of a 20% reduction in residual waste. That's 400,000. Now, considering the problems we've had in waste and with refuge collection, I think that's something we need to concern ourselves with. the other bits about the Trejohn waste and the income from commercial waste. I think the income from commercial waste is something that we need to think about, because that's a confidentiality matter, because we are in competition with other companies. The bulky waste collection, well, that has been there for a while now. There are a couple of things then further on in place, and the one I think which
Chair, can I just pop in on the waste?
Sorry, leader. Do you want to come in here?
Yeah, look, there's a number of ones you've run through, and obviously there's a lot in there that we'll need to come back to you on in terms of formal
Exactly,
response.
yes.
On the waste one though, if you're quoting a figure of 400,000, I believe that would be an error. I think the saving in waste is 200k, as I understand it. But again, that is predicated on moves to use reusable containers and some of the things that have already been trailed through other scrutiny committees, including our aim to remove over 10 million bits of single-use plastic. Alongside that, as you quite rightly identified, there are other decisions and discussions that we're having around how we stabilise the service post changes, and that could include further investment, but that won't be shown in this column. So as with the overall budget, there is a column for savings, and there's an even larger column for investment. So it is a bit of a swirl, some of this. So again, don't read it as a direct reduction in budget. There is a specific saving related to how we collect waste and what we use to collect waste. But the figure I understood was 200k, not 400.
Well, I can only go on what's in the report, leader. And in the report,
can I come in and give technical advice, Chair, at risk of openly contradicting the leader, which is always a dangerous move? It was 200 for each 10%. So at the moment, the option is 20%. So the 400k stands. But the leader is quite right. Cabinet have not made a final decision on what the percentage target should be. So if the percentage target was lower, that figure would be lower. But the bit the leader is absolutely right on is it only focuses on the savings side. And I know, for example, in the accepted pressures that I have built in a technical adjustment of putting £500,000 in for waste pressures. So notwithstanding, I've had to say that the 400k stands, and I believe it is predicated on the basis of the 20% assumption. If that doesn't change, it stays at 400. But the leader is quite right that at the moment there are also things on the other side that you don't see in quite the same detail at this stage. And 500 is bigger than either 200 or 400 any day of the week. So on that basis, the figures stand as is. Cabinet has the right to change them at any point, of course, but technically I stand by my budget.
I quite understand that, but you have to realise that this scrutiny board is looking at the report we have in front of us, and these are the savings that are indicated in this report.
And I'm giving you technical advice, Chair, that I am saying correct. That is 400 at the moment, and you should scrutinise on that basis, and I'm sure Cabinet and officers will reflect on any scrutiny comments that you give us. So I am giving you technical advice that the figure stands as of today.
Okay, thank you. Then we come on, if I can come back to the savings, there's an increase in street works and licensing in place, highways and transportation, increased charges from the Marina and Nabrock, increase in parking enforcement camera of £100,000. Now, considering the report that was in the in the Wales Online today about Gorse Road being one of the 20-mile-an-hour capture zones for the 85,000 people that are being caught, what are we going to do to increase the additional income from parking enforcement camera? Are we going to have another car, or are we going to go around more often with that car to increase the income of 100,000?
Yeah, simple answer on that one, Chair. It is an additional vehicle that we're proposing to purchase that would then see us being able to cover larger areas, because I think one of the concerns has been that the enforcement has not been uniform across the county. So again, the additional vehicle allows us then to deal with further hotspots where we are seeing infringements in terms of parking and other concerns that residents raise with us.
Okay, and there's a couple of others. There's one I think which is quite worrying for people will be the rationalisation of post-16 transport reflecting reduced demand, a savings of 68,000. I think a lot of these savings, along with the increase in burial charges of for for 2 years of 5% annual. When you consider that, it'd probably be around about 11% over the 2 years. And that applies also to the market and the licensing fees. There are a few others, but that...
Yeah, if I just come back on the burial fees, Hugh, just so you're aware, obviously we're in a competitive market in terms of burials. So we do look at neighbouring authorities because obviously residents do have the option to bury their loved ones outside of Swansea, which is what some people choose to do. So again, the fees that are proposed there are ones that are based on the best market intelligence in terms of making sure we remain competitive with neighbouring authorities.
I understand that, Leader, and I also understand about the commission charges as well. And we're now in a competitive market with that. I won't mention the names of the crematoria that are around this area, but they are. It is quite sickening to see the effect that this type of business is having on the general public. I find that it's quite sickening, really, when there's a competitive market for actually cremations. But I see right across the board, there's increases right across the board on various other issues. And one of the ones that does, I think, must be worrying for people in the city centre, and that's the revised Swansea market rent charges of 5%. Now, again, we're in very difficult times, and our city, as you quite rightly point out, Leader, our city centre is under pressure all the time. And I think if we are, and our market is, without shadow of a doubt, the best in Wales and maybe one of the best in the UK, general market, that is. And I think we need to be really, really sensible about how we price it to make sure that the market is full all the time. And I'm quite sure you realise that. Can I move on now to adults?
Chair, just on that point again, Chair, if you'll allow me on that one. I mean, you'll be aware that during COVID, we put together a significant package of support for market traders. And post-COVID, we deferred increases in rent. I know Councillor Hopkins is on the call as well and be able to give you further detail on that. So again, in terms of the overall picture where market rents are concerned, they are well below where they would otherwise have been had annual increases been added. So we have already built that into the model. And again, we're seeing very high occupancy rates in the market currently. So, we are mindful that we do not raise rents above what is reasonable. But again, there is a long tail on this one in terms of previous packages of support are still benefiting market traders because we are well below where we otherwise would be.
I understand that, Leader, and I see Mr. Smith has put his hand up to speak on this one as well. But before he does, I am glad to see that we are looking at development of strategy for caravans and motorhome parking, because that has been requested on numerous occasions, and I remember speaking to you about that, Leader, some time ago. Mr. Smith, do you want to come in on this item?
Yeah, so it's a couple of technical matters. I will try to tread carefully. As you know, given the lateness of the Welsh Government settlement, I had no option but to certify it as exempt from call-in. I'm reminded that you're well aware that there is an opportunity for pre-decision scrutiny through both the Education and Social Services panels plus yourselves on the wider stuff. I'm sure there will be a written letter in due course raising concerns on all of those items that have been raised. I will take the opportunity to feed back to the relevant directors. I've made a quick list of all of them so that they can be starting to work on anticipating the matters that you wish to have further detail and clarity on. That is the right and proper role and function of scrutiny. I have the greatest respect for all members. But in terms of technical advice, my quick tally is that's more than £3 million worth of proposals that you have concerns on. That is right, the scrutiny challenges it, and it's for directors and relevant cabinet members to explain what they are. But if you do the maths, if £3 million were not acceptable ultimately to scrutiny, to the public, to cabinet, there are only so many options you can go for. The Leader has already indicated previously we are not at the end that a number of other authorities are that are at the 10% mark. And it's a difficult choice to be made about what is service-specific savings versus use of reserves versus levels of council tax. But that's over £3 million worth. I'm not trying to denigrate in any way, shape or form. I have the greatest respect for you and every panel member here, but I do just have to advise the scale of the number of items that cause concern, and I get why you have concerns over them, but the financial maths only works so many ways, and I'm sure you'll take it in the manner and intent it was intended, Chair. But it's incumbent upon me to just indicate the scale of difficult choices that are still to come. Thank you.
I agree with you entirely on that, Mr. Smith. I also note that you've taken money out of the equalisation reserve, because you mentioned it earlier on, to put inside the revenue budget this year, and there's still more money that could go into it. But that's a discussion not for this particular committee, that's for another committee or for another place. Deputy Leader, Councillor Hopkins.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. I just want to come in particularly on the market and just some reassurance that we sit down at least on a quarterly basis with market traders to discuss these issues and get some reassurance around the 5%. Because what we have done, we've worked with them over many, many years and given them lots of support, particularly during COVID. But we've not had a rent review for many, many years. We give a 5% increase last year and a 5% increase this year. And that's part of what we did plan through the medium financial plan. But it's been many, many years since we have looked at rents within the market. And we have got a serious, quite substantial investment programme, particularly into making improvements into market entrances as well. So it is working with the tenants at the market that when we are talking with the 5%, Chair.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. A couple of things I want to do on adult services. I understand what you're saying about Q2 and Q3 and the fact that there is going to be this problem with the core budgets and the way in which that they are hopefully going to come within a certain figure. But I noticed that that you've got in your continue with your recovery plan of 3 million. So I'm assuming that after Q4 or up to outturn on in April, we will continue with this £3 million savings that is indicated in this report. So that's that one, and then supported, Chair. And it's supported a number of supported accommodation placements, reduced support packages. That one I think I need to clarify with the cabinet member, because we did ask a question in council about that. The number of externally commissioned residential and nursing care placements for older people, the average length of stay to reduce by 2.5%. Again, I think that's a question for the cabinet member. I don't think we need to answer that one.
Yeah, just to give some context on all of those, the cabinet member and the director can give you more detail, but again, I've been asked a similar question since the papers were published, and just to reassure members, what this continues is the transformational activities that we're undertaking within social care. So again, moving towards more prevention and to deliver care at the earliest possible time in order to keep people living independently for longer. Inevitably, if we're successful in that, then the amount of long-term care that we have to deliver then reduces, and that's what some of those changes allude to. So again, the reassurance that we've given both publicly and to the people who've asked the questions is that it's not about a reduction in care, because as I said at the start of this, we've seen an increase at our front door of over 20%. So it's more care being delivered, but care being delivered in a slightly different way, which allows us to do more with the resources that we've got.
But it says in the report, and reduce the cost of in-house residential care, reduce the cost of in-house home care. So we are, using £250,000 in each one of those to reduce the costs. And I think you are right, Leader. We need to talk to the cabinet member and the relative head of service to discuss these issues. And again, it comes down to the one that I think most people will be really concerned about, and that's on social services, child and family. The independent commissioning care do not apply an uplift to the existing independent commissionery residential placements and foster placements. The reduction is £877,000. That is a considerable amount of money, and considering, as you just rightly said earlier on, Leader, the problem we have with the private sector, especially with children's care, is the costs seem to keep on going up and up and up. And as you rightly pointed out, also we have one which is costing £100,000 because of the complex nature of some of these placements. So I think it's very important that we ask the question, and we will ask the question of the cabinet member and also of the head of service for explanations on it.
I'll let you get the full answer from the cabinet members, but if it's the one I think you're referring to in terms of the reduction in number of placements, etc., then that's part of the eliminate agenda. So again, there's, as I said or alluded to earlier, given that we were previously providing placements with external providers, the fact that we are now able to provide those placements ourselves at a cheaper rate, that is part of how the market has changed. But again, I don't want to answer a question you haven't asked, so I'm trying to link what I think you've said with what I think the change is, and that is my understanding of why those changes are there. But quite right, you asked the question, and I'm sure both in social services scrutiny and here we can get you the answers.
Okay, thank you very much. Mr. Smith?
Yes, on this one, again, I'll tread carefully with the same caveat as the leader. You can ask specifically of the cabinet member and the relevant chief officer, but the budget is predicated on the same basis. And I have the same understanding as the leader on this one. The Welsh Government has said the eliminate agenda should be to remove profit from the third sector, private sector, and a move to more internal. So that saving is perfectly logical, having due regard to expressed Welsh Government plans and our own plans to bring more internally and avoid using profit-making third private sector suppliers. So, yep, it's a large number, but I'm in the same position as the leader on this one, but I'm sure you will get further clarification and assurance in due course. But it is most definitely linked to that Welsh Government eliminate agenda, leader and chair.
Thank you. But my final bit is to go back to table 1. In past years, we've seen the insurance fund being indicated in this particular. I have looked, but I can't find it. Maybe it's my fault, but I have seen nothing in there about the insurance fund. And I was wondering, I know we've had revaluations year on, year off, and the actuarial evaluation comes along every 3 years. But I see nothing in table 1 to indicate that. Can I ask, have we had any indication about the insurance fund?
Yes, I have. I have commissioned an independent actuarial review and received independent actuarial advice, and I have formed a view as a Section 151 officer that a draw from insurance reserves is possible. I refer you to that table 1 and note 18, which indicates that 2 sums of £3 million will be potentially drawn from reserves and used to fund potentially additional capital. That final decision has not been made. The reason for the coyness on line 18, but you are right to assume that that is inevitably linked to the insurance reserve and associated items of spend, is that I wanted to tread technically carefully, because to access the additional 5 million revenue, which may buy 50, 60, 70 million pounds worth of capital across Wales, requires us to prove additionality on our budget proposals. So there is a rationale as to why I've been a little bit coy in terms of my officer technical build, but you have rightly worked out what that item is most likely referring to in terms of my current planning assumptions and advice I've given to Cabinet. So I hope that gives you some assurance, Chair, but I'm happy to answer further if you need to. Some
assurance or insurance on it, yes. I take your word on it, and I wasn't quite sure what it was, but I had a very good idea that it might have been about the revaluation. But thank you very much for that. Obviously we will be sending a letter out to the relative officers. I think it is important that this initial scrutiny of the proposals is important. But as we know from past years, there will be further tweak into the budget back for the next one in February, and we will be having a look at it, scrutinising that again. The one thing I will ask the leader, and that is if he's going to add more money at the council meeting, if he can give us a little bit of information about whether or not that it needs to be scrutinised as well, because in the past we've had a few £1 million put in there and it hasn't been scrutinised. And I think for good governance sake, it would be a good idea if we had that. But in the meantime, can I thank leader? Sorry.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. Look, I mean, there are, as I said at the beginning, there are some unknowns, and you'll have known this when you were overseeing similar processes. Often money turns up very, very late in the day from governments, and certainly our grant position isn't known until long after the revenue position usually. So whilst I will endeavour to make decisions as quickly as possible with Cabinet where that's appropriate, there is still always the possibility of money turning up late and then us having to move things around or incorporate stuff, but we will try wherever possible to avoid that. One request in return from me, Chair, would be obviously absolutely respect the questions that you've raised today in terms of the proposals. All I would say is to try and make these sessions as productive as possible, as we do with all of the other scrutiny sessions. If there are questions that you have ahead of the session that you're able to forewarn us of, so that we can try and link your questions back to the detail in terms of the departmental proposals, then that would enable us to help answer more questions in the session rather than having to follow them up with a letter. But, you know, again, the opportunity, if you're able to do that, is always welcomed by us so that we can bring as much detail to the session as possible.
Okay, thank you, leader. I think the ones on social services, that was a miss of me. Perhaps we should have done that prior to this meeting, but you know that's the only other one. Okay, well, thank you very much all, and we now move on to the next item on the agenda, which, funnily enough, is Q2 revenue and capital budget monitoring. Leader.
Yeah, Chair, not a huge amount to add to what I included in my budget proposals. You will see that at Q2, there are significant pressures in social care, as we've discussed, and in place, primarily driven by the pressures on homelessness, but also some technical pressures that are transferred from education in terms of home to school transport into the Place Directorate. And they were ones that we obviously were aware of within education's budget previously. So in that respect, we have recovery plans, which the directors and cabinet members are working to deliver. And as I said previously, the aim there is to recover that position as best as possible by outturn, but we don't expect, given the scale of the current variance, for that to be down to zero. And again, just to be clear, there were additional sums put in just after the start of the year, which are already committed in there. So they form part of that figure that you see before you. But in terms of the overspend, which is where Mr. Smith quite rightly, like myself, is exercised on this point, there are overspends in addition to the extra sums that have already been put in. And that is where it's important that the recovery plans then do give us a more stable position, and that position improves as we get to Q3 and Q4. So with that, Chair, nothing really more to add. I think we've had a good debate around a lot of that when we've gone through the budget papers, but leave Mr. Smith to go through the technicals again.
Mr. Smith?
Yes, there are a few items I will add. I'll try to avoid repeating what the leader has said, and I echo everything that he has said, and I thank him for recognising some of the advice I have given. I have been very clear in my officer advice on the public record at second quarter to Cabinet. I have been much clearer with Cabinet members privately and much clearer with my colleagues, to the degree that if I were to repeat what I actually said, it would offend anyone with sensitivity, shall we say. My role is to remind, as per the report, that no one is allowed to overspend once the budget has been set. That's easy for me to say, much harder for colleagues to achieve given the pressures that there are, but that remains the case. So I'll just draw your attention to a couple of the technical matters. There will be a degree of repeating some of what the leader has said, but for the avoidance of doubt, as you can see in table 1 in 2.3, I am never going to be happy with a forecast £14 million overspend on two big service areas, and I will reserve my judgment for third quarter. If there is not a material improvement at third quarter, which is meant to be a forecast for the year, my mood will darken, and I'm never a happy treasurer. No treasurer is ever entirely happy. So I hope that there is material improvement and assurance for both scrutiny and cabinet. 2.8 in bold. The reason it's in bold, I continue to remind no officer is allowed to overspend in line with council procedure rules, albeit I recognise that no one chooses to willingly overspend. There are some very valid reasons and demand pressures upon us. Section 3.2, reiterating what the leader has said. The position in the current year is massively aided by being able at outturn last year to have a £12 million plus brought forward balance added to contingency. Frankly, that is the only thing that is enabling Cabinet to have tolerated a £6 and £2 million element of the overspend in those two big areas. If the forecast at third quarter and at outturn does not materially improve from second quarter, there ain't any figure to add to next year's budget, which is going to cause me grave difficulty, I'm afraid. But as it stands, there is sufficient in contingency to triage down most of that. I set out in 3.2, emphasising what I said with the budget proposals. These are all one-off actions and do not address any of those structural based problems going forward into 25-26, which is why I was fairly bleak and dark in my mood around some of those pressures that affect the potential budget going forward. Section 4, we did set prudently still quite high levels of central inflation because we didn't believe that inflation as a council had gone away. And we've been able to draw down some of those, but there was still over 5 million available at second quarter to help further triage the overspend, particularly in social services and place. But again, the budget proposals in front of you make assumptions that there will be less money available in central contingency and central inflation going forward. You can't have the penny and the bun as a council. If you decide to make reductions ultimately in council to central pots, then if services continue to overspend, there will not be the same degree of in-year protection afforded, and that is what weighs upon me. In more positive mode, section 6 set out my revenue summary excluding capital financing, because that is done below the line and washes into capital equalisation reserve. Even with all my doom and gloom, because of the large one-off central pots we had, we are able at second quarter to mitigate that to a net overspend forecast of £1 million, just under £1 million. And for anyone who listened in my advice at Cabinet, in December, we got the one-off money for teachers' pensions, teachers' pay, and both of those have been baselined into next year's budget. But crucially, in addition, there was just under £4 million of general support. So notwithstanding my concerns about everything above the line in terms of service pressures, that £4 million of additional support, which Welsh Government has recognised and given every authority a different amount, but on a proportionate basis, recognising the very real pressures we have, albeit that was one-off, it's been baselined into the settlement, so it won't be expected to be repeated. That clearly is more than the forecast overspend at second quarter and will be massively beneficial to the authority in terms of being able to evidence that it could balance its overall budget for 24-25 as it is legally required
Can I stop you
to
there
do.
for a minute, Ben? You know, you said the £4 million was put into the base budget, you said.
Correct.
Is that still there then? Is that still an ongoing increase in the base budget?
So it is, in the sense that perhaps if I did take a slight divergence, you'll be aware that the Welsh Government reports on a headline like-for-like settlement, which is the 4.7 million. It's the £21 million worth of budget increase we got. But in cash money terms, we got £34 million because most of it was money for teachers' pay and teachers' pensions, which is neutral. Right. But that £4 million was also transferred into the revenue support grant settlement. And very generously, Welsh Government treated it as a base transfer for the current year. It would have been perfectly reasonable for them to have claimed it was new money because we never expected it. So it has been provided. The point I'm making, Chair, is you would not expect there to necessarily be another emergency bailout fund because it's already been put into base. It was very generous to Welsh Government. Now, having said that, I can't anticipate there's any more money. Welsh Government may, during 25-26, undoubtedly recognise the ongoing pressures that local authorities face and may find their own proverbial jam jar and work their own proverbial Harry Potter magic to be able to find some additional support in year. But does that give you sufficient on that, as I've taken a bit of a divergence? I'll just return to wrapping up on the budget monitoring, Chair.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. So having emphasised that, tucked away in section 6.1b, there is reference to I stuck at my advice of a £7 million underspend on capital financing charges. And as you heard from my answer to Councillor Will Thomas in the budget, I anticipate that's going to be better as a result of the increased rates and stickiness of base rates, because short term we make more on our cash deposits because those are variable rates versus our borrowing, which is fixed. I gave stern advice in F. I've not normally given such stern advice, which was to say you're basically out of options in the current year, in my humble opinion. But of course, I have to recognise Cabinet has the right to make decisions on use of reserves beyond that set in the budget. So I was warning that we were very likely at the limit of flexibility. That £4 million worth of additional Welsh Government grant, flipping it from over to under most likely as a whole, is incredibly helpful, and I may be able to soften my sternness at third quarter, but it doesn't soften my stance in terms of where we are likely to be going into the new year with those structural concerns. Capital budget is not surprising. It's in line, it's slow, it's low, but it's not dissimilar to previous years. And you've heard me every time rock up here and rub my hands in glee that I've got more cash in the bank, making me interest on balances. So whilst there are delivery issues, I'm only ever a happy treasurer when I haven't spent money. I like to have my gold in the treasurer's chamber and be counting it because it makes us cash money on our balances and very helpfully assists our overall revenue position. Rest of the report in normal format. Now, just to draw your attention to Appendix A, which makes clear all on a page, services 14 million over, £13 million worth of triage and getting it down to the net £1 million reported. Below the line, £7 million gain on net interest at this point in time, which will probably go better, which enables me overall 1 minus 7 is the 6 million, which is why you see a material reduction in the planned use of earmarked reserves. And I emphasise planned use of earmarked reserves. But again, as consistent with the first quarter, I still point out that is £19 million currently anticipated coming from reserves. And that is one of the matters that has been raised by a whole of local government, the WLGA, and was some of the feedback in the financial sustainability review from Audit Wales. Authorities make choices on using reserves to decide to maintain services and make choices on council tax. That is a legitimate policy decision. But the concern is the sustainability of it when authorities are having to take still quite substantial draws from reserves to balance off those very challenging choices and decisions. The rest of the report includes director comments about the reasons for why things are over under, and they are better placed than me to answer them. I can only report on what I am advised, and I can only control my own spend, which is my own directorate, capital financing, and all the technical jiggery pokery. Only the spending departments, and I'm most concerned about the two big overspenders, can control what they spend. And I do have enormous sympathy with both directors because some of it is buffeted by events. It's very easy for me to sit in my ivory tower and pontificate about why no one should overspend. But there are valid, real reasons why demand, demography, prices are against us in those areas of especially homelessness and social care, and you would hear the same conversation in 21 other authorities in Wales and several hundred authorities in England. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. Are there any members or any comments? No? Well, thank you very much, Mr. Smith. I think you got a great deal of sympathy in the fact that you rub your hands at the fact that nobody's spending any money and you've got all that money saved up, and hopefully at some stage you'll spend it. But the only worrying aspect is, again, 32% of the capital projects are being completed by quarter two. Hopefully quarter three will be better, and then the outturn will show a major increase in the capital spend. But thank you very much. Any other further comments? If not, okay. Can I thank the leader and thank Mr. Smith for attending to discuss the budget and the financial position we are at quarter two. Thank you. The next item on the agenda is quarter two performance monitoring report. Councillor David Hopkin.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. I don't intend to go through the report in any detail. I think at this stage it's been referenced throughout many times throughout this meeting date, but pressures particularly in social care and homelessness. And I think we need particularly to recognise some of the good practice that we're doing, and as well as the challenges we face in these areas. And I would say our staff have always been our best asset. And I'd like to put on record my thanks to the staff in all these areas for the good practice that they do. I'd like to hand over to Susie at this point, who's going to take us through the report in any detail. I'm more than happy to answer any questions at the later stage. Thanks, Chair.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Susie Richards.
Okay. This report on page 62 of your packs sets out the Council's performance for the second quarter of 2024-25. It describes the progress towards meeting the Council's wellbeing objectives set out in the corporate plan, and where corrective actions to improve performance and efficiency take place. The full report can be seen in Appendix A, which, as 2.1 and 2.2 describe, uses an integrated format to report on progress towards each wellbeing objective, in turn providing both qualitative and quantitative data. If you'd like to return to the report in Appendix A on page 69, the page numbers are on the left, the format of the report opens with an overall assessment provided by the Chief Executive. The report then details progress towards each objective in turn, starting with the safeguarding objective on page 70 and a director's assessment of social services on page 71. It looks at the objectives steps for the 5-year corporate plan on page 72 and 73, and moves on to its success measures for 24-25 on the following page. It then moves on to performance indicators relating to safeguarding on page 76. And finally, it looks at risk in relation to safeguarding on page 78. So that structure is repeated as usual for each of the wellbeing objectives in turn. So going back to the report on page 63, section 2 focuses entirely on performance. 2.3 displays charts summarising overall performance for the corporate plan steps, the success measures and performance indicators, demonstrating that indicators overall are largely on track. Section 2.4 highlights examples of positive performance across the wellbeing objectives, and 2.5 details areas where the key performance areas have maintained a green status across quarter 1 and 2, again positive progress. Section 2.6 details challenges, particularly in respect of financial and demand pressures across services, again, particularly in social services and relating to homelessness, where several steps remain red. The report details 8 key performance indicators specifically, which missed their target by 5% or more. And importantly, for each of them, it details the action being taken in response. Finally, 2.7 describes how all the steps, performance measures and performance indicators are being reviewed annually as part of the January to March service planning process. Section 3 looks at strategic risks and issues linked to the wellbeing objectives. In April, Cabinet approved a new risk management framework, which created new risk levels, strategic, operational and project, and it separated risks from issues. Issues being risks which have already materialised. Quarter 2 is the first quarter which presents risks and issues in management reports under the new framework. So, as at 30th of September, there were 15 strategic risks and 5 strategic issues directly relating to the Council's objectives. Key changes are detailed in 3.2, such as the creation of a new risk and reclassification of 5 risks as strategic issues. And this recognises that those risks have materialised and are actively being managed now. Section 4 concludes that in accordance with the Local Government Elections Act, the Chief Executive has reviewed performance and risk management updates, and in light of the steady progress across objectives and the active management of challenges, he's satisfied that the Council's performance and risk management frameworks effectively support the Council's priorities. I'd be happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Susie. I think one of the things that we've been when looking through this is that it's just a snapshot of performance, and the fact is that if you go back and look at some of the issues, you know, where you see the rag state, and I'll give you an example. Developing a new waste strategy on page 110. Inherent risk is red, but overall rag. So the problem is these snapshots. I think we need to understand what they are, and that is that when that report was made, that was the position, or that was the inherent risk that was there. So it is you're in a difficult position, because if we ask you something, we can only refer back to this report, that snapshot at that time, and it's because it's not really a live document. It's a document that tells us what's happened at that particular time, and it is more of an information report for information than a live report that we can interrogate, if you like. We're interrogating what has happened. What we need to know is what we're going to do in the future. So one of the things that we're going to be looking at and talking to you about is how we can actually project what we're going to do, as opposed just a bit of history, but project what we can do. I have a question from Councillor Mary Jones. Oh, Anne.
Thank you, Chair. It's just talking about the rag status, actually. I'm not on sure page I'm on. 78, I think it is, on the actual report, where it's got the safeguarding as red all the way through. And I know this is difficult because it's not your service area, but that is really, really concerning, because safeguarding is our #1 priority. And to have a rag status all the way across is really, really worrying. And I think we need to write to the Cabinet member to get some more information about this, because, as you know, we've all had our training recently, and it's very disappointing to see that it's red all the way through, even to the 30th of September last year. So maybe we can have a little bit more information, and also about the disabled facilities grants and the connecting care, because they are very big areas, very concerning. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. That's the very point I was on about, Councillor Jones, is we are having a snapshot, but we don't know what we're doing to actually improve that position. I got a question from Councillor Dye Jones.
Thank you, Chair. It's on 2.6, page 61. You've got the care and support plans. That's hit 21.5%. I know that's really low against the 60%. So I was wondering how. I know you put a dedicated team in there to improve it. I got 3 questions really. How close to the 60% do you envisage the dedicated team will be in Q3 and 4? What does the team look like? How many managers and team leaders and operatives are in that team? And with the target of 60%, that's allowing 40% less to be missed. Just wondering if that target can be improved in the future. I don't know if you could answer that, or we need to write. Thank you.
Cabinet member, Councillor David Hopkins.
I was going to suggest it's probably best that the director answer these questions, and we will respond back in writing. I think that would be probably the most efficient way to do it, rather than us try to answer that, Councillor.
I think you're quite right, Councillor Hopkins, and you know, I think it's a bit unfair to ask Mr. Richards, Susie Richards, to actually answer that question, because it is a specific question about social services, and we will have to write to that director and get an answer from them. Okay. Is anybody else got any questions on this Q2 performance? If not, can I thank you very much for your report, and thank you, Councillor Hopkins, for attending, and thank you, Ms. Richards.
Thank you.
Thanks all.
Okay, item 9 on the agenda is the work programme. Has anybody got any comments on the work programme? As you can see, that we will scrutinise the budget. I'll get it up now, I think it's in February. So, yeah, on the 18th of February, where we will have further report on the budget. Okay, any issues? Okay, item 9 is the work programme, which is, you see, the one that I think we have been asking for some time is, unfortunately, it is a long way off. It's 6th of May, and that is when we have Freedom Leisure coming in. You know, they took over all our leisure centres, etc. And we have been asking for some time for them to come in because, you know, of our concern as a council into our leisure facility. The only other two you will see there is Building Control Annual Report and also the Swansea Central Area Placemaking Plan. Those are to be announced. Hopefully we can fit them in some way between now and that date in May. If not, obviously they'll run over. Councillor Peter Black.
Now, are we likely to have an in-camera session looking at some of the big projects, particularly the financing of them at some stage?
Yeah, we are, and I think on Tuesday, the 18th of February, which is the next week, then we were going to do it, but because of the budget now, it may have to go through to the 11th of March. As you can see, the head of planning and city regeneration is coming to the 11th of March, and we are going to ask for an in private session about that one, in camera session, that one, with regards to the financing of the city centre projects, but also the city deal projects. Okay, and then the next item 10, are the letters that we've sent. And are there any questions on that? If not, can I thank you all for your patience this morning, and look forward to seeing you at the next meeting. Thank you.